to Mindcrime Liberty Show with me, Swithin Dobson, and him, Tim Patton. Again, we're joined by Rik Storey and this time to discuss whether the family is getting better or whether it is in decline. Tim.
The idea of this episode series has come out of reading both Peter Hitchens and Matt Ridley. You could call them, optimists or white-pilled optimists who think that not Peter Hitchens, Steven Pinker and Matt Ridley, who are kind of optimistic thinkers. Matt Ridley has his great book, The Rational Optimist, as well as, of course, Steven Pinker. And reading paleocons and paleo-libertarians ranging from Hans Hoppe to Peter Hitchens and Roger Scruton, who think that today, in some ways, is a decline from the past. The biggest, and to a certain extent, this episode series is investigating this, to whether or not this is true, whether or not this idea things are declining or things getting better, or maybe things in the future will be better. Another theory of history in the present. So today's topic is on the decline of families. I think statistically, of all the paleocon points that you can make, this is actually one that's probably bared out by the most by the data. If you look in 1950s, the non-marital share of births is under 30% in all across all demographics. In UK, it's actually even a little lower, much lower. And in both countries, we saw a rise in the out-of-wedlock births. And there's no corresponding rise in shotgun marriages afterwards either. So we see a clear rise in out-of-wedlock births. We see a rise in divorce rates, although that has gone down a bit since the highs in the 70s. In Britain and the United States have had slightly different statistical trends, but I think they're largely the same in some areas, enough to make some generalizations. I think one of the big problems with this data is cohabitation, which is a sort of criticism you can make, which is also a kind of weakening of the family. It's not a kind of legal thing enforced by the courts. But then again, this is a sort of, what constitutes a family. It's sort of like the old debate of what exactly constitutes a firm to a certain extent. Is two people living together for 7 years with children? Are they just married in name only? And in the pre-existence of courts, where exactly is family? So first of all, my first question to the panel then is, in particularly Rik is here, is do you agree with the idea that family formation, families statistically are on decline? And what do you make of the rise of cohabitation regarding that? Rik?
Well, I do think that, and this is speaking from the context of the UK, where I'm based, as you can probably tell by my accent, I do see that there is a decline in families, certainly what we would call the traditional family. But I mean, you'd be forgiven for thinking, well, actually, things are not really that bad if you were to just look at the divorce statistics from the Office of National Statistics in the UK. We have seemingly the lowest stats for divorce at the moment since 1971. And I mean, just being conservative, the figure is probably around 8 in every 1,000 marriages ends in divorce. Now, that doesn't seem like a particularly high figure. And, the average duration of those marriages which end in divorce is only around 12 and a half years. And so it seems to say, well, these are just a few instances where people seem to have made a mistake. People look at the fact that the most commonly given ground for divorce is unreasonable behavior, which overtook adultery as the most common ground quite some time ago. So, it seems as though, okay, a few instances people have made a mistake. We might also look at the fact that women seem to be initiating divorce procedures much more. So we might just put this also down to women having greater freedom in society as they're working more, they're becoming more independent. So a lot of people would stop there and they'd say, well, there doesn't seem to be much of a problem, right? Well, I would disagree myself. I would look at the fact that overall birth rates are declining. The average age of marriage, for instance, for a man, it's 38, and for a woman, rather worryingly, in biological terms, the average age is 36. The religious ceremonies, which were traditionally attached to marriage, they make up less than a quarter of marriages in the UK now. And it's 9 out of 10 couples are cohabiting before they're married. And even where these are religious ceremonies, it's still 8 out of 10 of those couples who have been cohabiting before marriage. And we can also look at the fact that 70% of couples who are under the age of 30 are cohabiting and still not married yet. So what does this mean? Well, I think the statistician who was involved in putting these figures together for the Office of National Statistics, he summed this up quite well. He said, marriage rates for opposite sex couples are now at the lowest level on record. This continues a gradual long-term decline seen since the early 1970s, with numbers falling by a third over the past 40 years. The popularity of religious ceremonies also fell to historic lows for the second year running, with fewer than 1 in 4 couples choosing to get married through a religious ceremony. Now, is this necessarily worrying? Perhaps it's because I am just personally a traditional Catholic, and so maybe it's just my personal foibles. That's why I'm getting worried about this. But when we consider that, excepting wartime, of course, rates of marriage and divorce were much more stable, and even in the case of divorce, completely flatlined before the 1960s, we can see that these continuing trends are probably disturbing. This is something that's relatively unprecedented. And it's not just for the UK. Speaking in a European context as well, marriage rates have halved since 1965 and divorce rates have more than doubled. And that's also since the year 2000, I should say, since the year 2000, the figure for children born out of wedlock has also close to doubled. And we can see also that there are general cultural trends going on. There's a general sense that the loyalty, the commitment, which would have traditionally been associated with marriage, is on the decline as well, given the fact that over 65s are divorcing and remarrying at greater rates, significantly so that this has given rise to the label of the silver separators. But one might argue, especially if one is of a more morally libertine character, why is any of this a problem at all? Why is this a problem? Now, I would probably point to the work of an anthropologist in the 20th century, early 20th century, called J.D. Unwin. He did probably the largest study of worldwide cultures, and historically, the patterns of marital behavior, morality associated with courtship, and sexual relations more generally. He noted, and this man was not a Christian, he didn't necessarily have skin in the game in that sense, he didn't have an axe to grind, you might say, and yet he noted that we could actually hierarchically rate which forms of, which norms, I should say, which marital norms promoted sustainable civilization, and what were those norms which, when they were abandoned, gave that civilization about 2 to 3 generations before it would collapse, we might say. And at the top of the list was what we might recognize in our Western context, which is heavily influenced by Christianity, was monogamous marriages where separation or divorce was considered taboo. So we might say something that I've said in various other podcasts, that Christianity, particularly in this civilization preserving aspect, is the best cultural technology that we have. and that we shouldn't really be surprised by these trends over the past generation. That ties, loyalty, the necessity of getting married, and various other kinds of sexual moral norms that come with all of that are being abandoned, and that this might have further social consequences as well, which of course we can talk about. For my part, just to be open and honest about things, about where I'm coming from and what my rhetoric might be here. As I've said, I'm a traditional Catholic, and so my view is that those cultures which have understood that love, marriage, sex, and procreation, but those four things necessarily go together, in the sense that if any of those things, love, marriage, sex, and procreation, were to be separated from the others and treated as being different or not necessarily attached to the others, there wouldn't be any social consequences as a result of separating that or giving a sense of license to any of those. If you do separate them, this will lead to cultural pathologies and societal problems at large. Now, that's probably not going to be terribly surprising for a lot of people. You've mentioned names like Peter Hitchens and figures like that. I mean, they think, more or less along the same lines as I do. I suppose perhaps next then the question is, well, does cohabiting and not being married and treating marriage and sex and that sort of thing with more license, does that actually result in these societal problems that I'm talking about? I'm not sure what your views are on that, gentlemen. I'll shut up for a moment and let you get a word in.
Just on what constitutes a family, I mean, it would be something that would be a recognizably different unit from your parents. So in sort of biblical language, leaving and cleaving. So today, if you sort of live in a different household with your sort of girlfriend or boyfriend, then that's sort of a separate family unit, even if it's not recognized legally. It functionally operates the same way. And actually, before the Marriage Act of the mid-19th century in England, they would have been considered common law, man and wife. It was only with the Marriage Act of the mid-19th century, which interestingly gave more power to the state with respect to marriages outside the hands of the Church of England. Did that actually come in? Interestingly, Gladstone opposed the act on that grounds that it was giving the state more power at the expense of the church. So yeah, cohabitation clearly is marriage, just not a very permanent one. Is it in decline? Well, the divorce figures don't seem that high if you look at it on an annual basis, but the issue really is longitudinal. If you look on a cross-sectional basis, they don't look too high. But if you look at the number of marriages that kind of end in divorce after, say, like 20 years or whatever, it's it's not as high as it was. And the last data I have for this is 1998, is like 35%, probably like 37%. So a vast proportion of first-time marriages will end in divorce over time, just not necessarily in 1 year. Now, from a whole host of different sociological analysis, the children of people who are divorced don't do very well. And also, interestingly, it does affect the performance and sort of mental well-being and et cetera, of adult children when their parents get divorced as well. That isn't talked about as often, but there is evidence to that effect. So when you have children not brought up by their biological parents, their outcomes on average are worse. More delinquency, etc. Their average earnings are lower. Higher crime rates, etc., etc. Add this in as well. the most likely candidate to abuse you as a child is mother's boyfriend, who isn't the biological father. So yes, I think the family is in decline. I mean, it still exists. It's just not a particularly permanent form, which is a problem, for the reasons I just outlined. So yes, in brief, yes, it is in decline, and yes, it is a problem. Tim.
I'm gonna respond first to comments, and we'll get on to the next set of questions. As far, or if you want to comment back on this, as far as the decline, I think I in general agree with both of your summations. But I might to some extent disagree why and what, which we'll get into the later questions. But the rise of cohabitation to me is interesting, and one of the things I think is interesting, as reading Unwin, I do think he's a great sociologist or anthropologist, is the state in some ways is both weaker and stronger than in Victorian or Edwardian times, the 1860s through like 1960s, roughly speaking. So in some ways, all families, including both of you, I'm single, I assume both of you are married. In some ways, as the court's speaking, I mean, if either of your, I'm not trying to offend you specifically, but either of your wives wanted a divorce, they could easily get it. So in some ways, all families, including Amish families and Mennonite families and Hutterite, including they're all the courts. So, we don't have the Roman court system. We don't have the Victorian court system. So all marriages in some ways are less stable because the court doesn't guarantee them. Now we can get into an esoteric discussion about what a private law society or an ANCAP society would look like, or what an anarcho-syndicalist society would look like. But in some ways, if either partner wants to leave at any time you want, it doesn't really matter if you say your vows or not. To a certain extent, it's built on the social circumstances as well as the courts, or whatever is the enforcing agency in your society, which this in both our societies, the government. And the government is actually probably a family breaker-upper, if anything, in various ways. So I do agree that it's in decline. I do totally agree with that. And I do agree it's a problem. I do agree it's a problem that for the children. Now, I do think there is some factors which can cut both ways. Brian Kaplan is great on the statistics, and one of his comments is, people who are more likely to get divorced are more likely to have children that are going to be somewhat, what's the politically correct word, not doing as well. I mean, there's a certain extent, like, some things are just inheritable. His comment about like the inheritance of religion. If your parents are religious and your children are religious, what explains the intergenerational, the following down the generations of change? Why do some people fall away and why do some people stay? So I do agree that it is this kind of problem, single parents and things like that. I do totally agree with that summation. I just to a certain extent disagree why, and in some ways, again, all families are weaker thanks to the state than compared to the 1870s. We're all sort of voluntarily married. If anything, currently, the women, according to the courts, probably have more power than the men, which is much different than the Unwin conception in his, I think he takes the 16th century England as well as the Roman variety as well. But next question, so I'll get into the why question. So if there is a decline, why has it occurred? My in general summation is it's mostly due to the rise of technology, in particular industrialization. You could also cite birth control and the rise of state daycares. But again, birth control to a certain extent is predicated on industrialization and figuring out how biology and things like that work and having the technology to do something about that. Anthony Comstock was only going after very, very small levels of things like abortion and going after zygotes or tying your ovaries. These are not procedures that were available to the Romans or the societies that Unwin was talking about. There's also the quality versus quantity of children debate. Plenty of people invest in there, and there's also just the various one-child policies as well, and of course the rise of feminism and education of women as well. And I mentioned the decline of traditional religion. Although I think religion cuts both ways, I think there are some anti-family tendencies within Christianity. In particular, Paul's a single guy. He views, you could argue that Paul views as accommodation. But, so I'm going to ask Rik first. Why do you think there has been a decline? And of my summations of decline, what do you agree with and what do you disagree with?
Well, I certainly agree with you that young men in the West these days, where they realize that they will be probably in a disadvantageous position, not least of all in financial terms, if they were to enter into a marriage contract without very, very serious prenuptial agreements. I can see that, of course. And, you're also right to point out that, for instance, in the medieval period, a Christian marriage could very much just have been a couple, who were cohabiting, and then they go off to the church and they simply have a priest just bless them, and then they go their ways. So is it hugely different to the phenomenon we see today of couples just cohabiting and not really having anything to do with the state, not really notifying the state? So my answer generally is this: okay, yes, marriage should primarily be a Christian matter. The fact that the state has so much involvement in marriage and has produced a situation where, because of liberal tendencies to want to even over-empower minorities and minority groups and weaker parties and that sort of thing, they have given women an imbalanced amount of power in most divorce proceedings, and even to have men's rights organizations. I mean, these are considered fringe, and they're considered bad almost. I mean, they don't tick a lot of boxes for feminist organizations, which obviously exercise a great deal more political clout. But anyway, not to digress, my point is that I would see the level of involvement that the state has, and even the rise of the modern state itself, as being a departure or perhaps even a perversion of Christendom and the pre-modern European life world and worldview, and the concept of man and what marriage is, and all of these things. I think it's all connected myself. So in terms of the origins, where did this all start to go wrong? Well, I mean, I've written about this elsewhere. I don't want to go into a great deal of detail in this, but you can see that from the medieval period there were certain ideas which were favoured by certain bourgeois and political elites, and it granted a certain degree of freedom from the church. And over time, these ideas, which were much more individualistic and in which beliefs were considered to be something much more private, these began to develop, and over time they evolved into what we would now call the secular liberal state, the Leviathan state of Hobbes, in which the only public belief, the only public creed, is to declare that all beliefs are a private matter. And so it's to have greatly individualized and privatized beliefs, which at one time would have been much more public. And so over time in our Western liberal condition, however you want to put it, our modern state, we've become more and more individualistic. And this has, of course, corresponded with a decline in having to take Christian beliefs seriously, having to, actually adhere to any sort of cultural framework, to the extent that we're largely entering quite a sort of a postmodern period in which it's becoming increasingly difficult to define things, and really the state is having to increasingly define things for us, and it's not necessarily following a trend which would result in what we would recognize as greater freedom. Again, it's more about defending the minority groups, you see, because if belief is just a private matter, then the more disparate and smaller different groups and identities and systems of beliefs there are, the better, really. And majority groups are, really presented with a certain amount of distrust. And I would argue, of course, that this is why the ethnic European majorities in Western countries and Christianity, which is still, if only on paper, a majority in those countries, they are treated with a certain amount of distrust. And likewise with the marital situation, where women are perhaps given a disproportionate, an unfair advantage in legal matters, we see that these majority groups also seem to, find themselves not as much at home, really, in their own countries. And it does seem as though, governments and wherever sources of political or cultural power seem to be, they exercise a certain amount of distrust towards those majorities. So I'm sorry to digress there, but I do think that that's very much relevant. And so I would say that where our civilization or civilizations have departed from Christian morality, especially in the sense that it is a public belief, it is a cultural framework which not only undergirds but also oversees any political power or authority, wherever that's departed from, we're going to start to see problems. We will see civilizational decline, and I see the departure from marriage and the departure from those moral norms as being an embracing of the license that comes with secular liberalism, and having the state as a format and a middleman for all your social interactions, and so increasingly we've been able to exercise greater and greater irresponsibility. We've been able to palm off more and more of our what previously would have been communal responsibilities to the state, to a more centralized coercive power. And people have been increasingly happy to do that because, well, if I can have an easier life, if I can get away with certain things that perhaps I know I shouldn't be, but, I can have some justification for it and have some sexual license, that sort of thing, then okay, yeah, I'll go for it. Where is the incentive? Where is the incentive to do otherwise? Am I being policed by my neighbors? And is there any shame put upon me for divorcing or, going, trading in my wife for a younger model, that sort of thing? Do we have the same attitude towards marriage as before, where we say, right, as a man, my honor is at stake. I've made an oath to be with my wife for the rest of my life, to look after her through thick and thin. And I'm going to stick to that. I'm going to absolutely stick to that. I mean, that sounds very unusual, really, in our current context. That might even seem a bit mad, really, to think in that way. It might seem, excessively puritanical or moralistic. You know, the incentives socially to think that way and to follow through that sort of thing has increasingly disappeared, and it's also, you know, worryingly less apparent where those things will return from. You know, will they rise again, or will the decline just continue until there is civilizational collapse? Well, you know, if we look at the work of Unwin, we're led to believe that, you know, things will have to get a lot worse before they get better in this sense.
I would agree with much of what Rik says. I think, though, one important aspect he didn't mention, although not direct, he may have done implicitly, but not directly, is the family these days is not really a productive economic unit anymore. After industrialization, during and afterwards, the locus of economic production was moved from the home into the factory, and today the modern day corporation. So there was much greater economic ties which kept people together because it was worthwhile. You know, they're a single productive household unit, and, you know, to break that up would be in a way like breaking up a firm. And this is an aside, and the problem with the coronavirus stuff. If you have to get rid of firms, it's not necessarily that easy to put them back together again, because you've got to put teams together. It's like a football team. If you have to sell all the players and build again, it takes forever to get a functioning team together again of any decent standard. So we now have a situation where both husband and wife can be independent economic agents in the marketplace, and can earn reasonably well in a corporation, and which means that there is far fewer financial ties keeping them together than there otherwise would have been. Add to this the welfare state, and apart from healthcare to some extent, actually, probably originally, actually, most of the healthcare probably went on children when it had state-funded stuff. It's only in recent years, when they didn't have the birth rates of the boomers was tiny, and everyone got old. And then, of course, there's the schools, and then you know, just basic welfare checks. The amount of externalizing your costs of your children onto other people is very high these days, which means that especially women, you know, they have even less financial ties to their husbands than they otherwise would have done, because, well, you know, oh, I know, if I get pregnant he goes, it doesn't really matter because I get the welfare checks through the post. That's fine. So that's not really much of an issue. And the way the state has gone is to sort of atomize everybody to individuals just within the state, and engaged in sort of the abolition of any sort of mediating institutions, such that they have no real power. And that's really happened with the family as well. So I would say the biggest factor has probably been the reduction of the family as an important economic unit, which really started with industrialization, and post-industrialization was accelerated by the welfare state. So that's where I would see primarily the reasons why they don't stick together, and there's no reason to continue that sort of family unit over time in a way that it would have been historically.
The industrialization point is something I entirely agree with. Industrialization is interesting. Unwin is writing at the time of, at the exact dates, I think he's writing it from the time of industrialization. And industrialization represents something kind of remarkably new. And this goes back to the point that Matt Ridley's made in The Rational Optimist. It's the sort of breakout from Malthusian conditions, and whether exact Malthus was right or wrong. You know, I'm not claiming that all societies before industrialization were miserable to live in. I'm not. That's a more radical claim. But we do with the advent of steam engines and putting steam engines in boats and on rails. The difference between living in Roman society and difference between living in medieval Europe, I mean, there's slight improvements, maybe some in sailboats and things like that. And not only it moves away from home, it moves it to the corporations, or if in the sort of Soviet model, the state-run corporations, like in which in some ways is so everyone's now is sort of yoked to the state, indirectly or directly. And of course, some people get direct state subsidies, so it's very hard to be independent of the state, which again eats into the strength of marriages. So this is where I'm going to go into the two final questions regarding here. So one of the paleocons' points is the idea that there's been a decline. And to me, to say there's a decline requires doing two things. You have to prove that the past was better, and you have to prove that the current state is worse than the past. And there's a great article on Unheard, and they said why trad wives aren't trad enough. And one of the points, again, is that housewives of the 1950s variety is a somewhat new phenomena. If you had a semi lower middle class or working class background, your mother worked outside the home by definition, or they involved in home production, which was a kind of job. And this is the movement into just the locus of consumption, a sort of consumer in chief. So even if you want to say the 1950s was a golden age, it only lasted for the upper middle class. Both my grandmothers worked outside the home from time to time. So when paleocons talk about the good old days, it's sometimes I'm not really sure when that is located. And as far as go back to 1359, which is the article suggests, I mean, there are problems with living in 1359. Again, I'm not a serfdom. Whether or not serfdom is terrible or great, there is more death from diseases. There is a higher infant mortality rate. There's a higher pregnant women mortality rate. There's higher workplace death. People die of more things. Now, maybe we had less diabetes. There are diseases of modern civilization. I'm fully aware of that. But life expectancies have went up, and other things have went up. And as far as the marriage is now a sort of love thing, as a sort of a soulmate thing, is there anything, quote unquote, is there anything wrong with that? I mean, in a related way, I think it's easier to see now who the Christians are and who the Christians aren't. Like, take R.C. Sproul. When I see it, or Jeff Durbin, they're both like American Calvinists. They don't get any social benefit for believing what they believe. They don't even get social. They believe in the total depravity and predestination, puts them at odds with the Catholics, and they believe that homosexuality is wrong, and they believe abortion is wrong. They don't get any social bonus points for believing that. In the 19th, might have gotten social bonus points for believing that. So in the same way with marriage, the people who stay married, it's almost a stronger commitment than historically the people who stay married and do so. So those are my two questions. Is the past as good as so do you think there's been a decline? Do you think the past is as good as the paleocons? And is there any benefits to modernity in the modern situation? I'll give it to both of you.
Would you like to go first, Swithin, or are you happy for me to?
Go for it, Rick. Go.
So, in terms of talking about golden ages and that sort of thing, I understand what you mean. The paleocons talking about the good old days, that sort of thing. There's even the expression, for instance, isn't there? Make America great again. So implied there is that there is something more than just an ideal which is being imposed upon the past. That there really was a tangible, empirically definable time in which things were better. Now, I think obviously we have to be careful. We can't be so naive as to hastily declare, golden ages of certain phenomena, any more than we should, for instance, simplistically posit a single explanation or cause of these phenomena or movements, etc. Things are not so black and white. These social matters are at least as complicated as the number and variety of people involved in them. So, okay, yes, I understand. It's not very easy to just point to a golden age or something like that. I think that the general meaning that's being implied by terms like that is that we can identify certain trends that have gone on, particularly within Western civilization. I'm talking about here, which indicates that, for instance, where monogamous marital norms were over time internalized and then upheld in societies. And over time, these societies became much more confident in those values, and those things became much more sustainable over time. That did occur. You can see that there was a difference between attitudes towards a king having a mistress or a plurality of mistresses and illegitimate children and that sort of thing in the early Middle Ages, as opposed to later. You can see that there was a trend there. You can see that over time, nobility and laymen, it didn't matter, that people found it just much more difficult. It was just much more difficult to have an affair. And these values, these cultural norms, much to the chagrin of a lot of academics and more atheistic-minded folks today in the West, they have informed and they have provided a lot of our moral lens for looking at things. This is why, for instance, today still, it's not considered to be acceptable for a president of the United States to be engaging in extramarital affairs or something like that. That necessarily has is the impact of Christianity on our civilization. This is the long-lasting impacts of it. So okay, I would think it was foolish to say but there's nothing good about modernity, that we don't have anything to be grateful about modernity. And I've bashed modernity here in this very talk. I've spoken against it in my writing, but we have to accept that there are some goods. It has benefited the common good, that we've had some technological advances. I think the greater question here really is what actually makes for a good civilization or society, or a bad civilization or society. I think that's really what we're getting at. We need to answer that before we can start to say, well, were things better in the past? In terms of what? According to what standard are we talking about?
I would say, with respect to a golden age, I don't really think golden ages really exist in certain respects. Certain have better ports and worse than others. 1950s, was it the case that you had workers who didn't work outside the home from working class or low middle class backgrounds? Most of them probably. That said, house prices, for example, in say the early 1970s, were so low that they could easily be paid with on one salary. So it might be interesting to see what the difference is between 50s and the 70s actually here. I mean, from my calculations, if the house prices had continued with general price inflation since 1971, the average house price would be about 110 or 15,000 pounds in the UK, and today it's like 240,000. Now, obviously, there's lots of regional discrepancies, except certainly by the early 1970s, and this is a point Sean Gabb would make, if you had your husband, you had a wife, and you had a couple of kids, 2 or 3, you could relatively easily support them, at least with respect to housing costs and food and things, which is really not particularly easy to do today. That said, I would say that the fact you move production outside the home and you have schooling, it kind of leaves wives with relatively less to do in the home. I mean, basically, keep the house tidy, and then wait for the kids and the husband to come back. And so I think sort of that post-industrial kind of model is something to fuel feminism to some extent. I do note, however, that the early feminists were leisured ladies of the upper middle class who probably had other things to do and then decided they wanted some political influence. So it's certainly not the case that feminism was had its origin in sort of like the bored lower middle classes. That certainly doesn't seem to be the case historically. But it does mean that households is less of a productive or interesting environment. And so it isn't surprising then that you do then get the move towards women working outside the home. That said, I mean, if you did have a number of mothers who didn't work, at least not until their children went to school, and there were quite a few of them, then, you know, you do get some social ties, which would sort of mean you have more sort of parental involvement with the children, the younger ages. But that simply doesn't happen today, and they say the daycare numbers are significantly higher, and the amount of time that biological parents spend with their children, especially at the younger ages, is significantly lower than is, well, optimal. And if you ask most women, they would say that they wouldn't want to work outside the home while their children before they went to school if they had the finances not to do so, but they think that they have to work to have a particular standard of living to maintain, so they don't. Now, of course, whether it's true that they need the standard of living they think they need is another question, but that's sort of like the cultural kind of norm. So I do think that's a decline for the children especially. But of course, yeah, technological advances, etc., are beneficial. You know, death rates and of children, etc., women in childbirth are much lower. The big question, I think, really is, and this is a general, more economic question, which sort of like the mutualists would ask, is whether you can have sort of the modern industrial society without it being dominated by large corporations or locating most production outside of homes. And I think, interestingly, with coronavirus and post there, with modern technology, I think we're going to see a return to some extent, a more pre-industrial model. Now, you'll still probably be employed by an employer and be a quote-unquote wage slave, but there'll be much more home working, and the home will be considered a much more will become a much more productive place. It will not just be a place of consumption as it had been, let's take date post Second World War until, say, 2019. So that will be an interesting change, and see whether that changes any family dynamics will be of interest. So yes, I think there is a decline, but to say that it is a golden age in the way that some paleocons would describe, I think, is misplaced.
I hope you don't mind, Tim, if I follow up, because I realise your question was a two-parter, and I would like to follow on with what Swithin was saying there. I couldn't agree with you more, Swithin, and actually I love the fact that you are focusing on children at the centre of what you're saying there. How readily does the society, the civilization, whatever, encourage the flourishing of children? And the reason I say that is because, you know, my concept of the good in terms of society depends on my concept of God. For me, transcending the false dichotomy of the Euthyphro dilemma, which is God good because there's such a thing as goodness, or is something good because God has declared it good? The traditional Christian view transcends that by simply saying God is good. Okay, all the time God is good. So in my view, a civilization is good because it will be reflecting godliness. It will be reflecting certain virtues. It will be promoting a distinct form of human flourishing and life, of course, and necessarily, or more especially, we could say that would be focused on the children. The role of men in that society, of course, okay, that would be one of sacrifice and responsibility. In order for them to want to do that, they have to really have skin in the game in society. At the moment we see, young men in the West, suicide rates are worryingly up. And men don't want to take a lot of responsibility. They'd rather, play video games or something like this. The emotional maturity of our young men has actually declined significantly, and women as well. As you've said, really well, Suhan, you brought some excellent points there. Women are not being encouraged to understand their God-given role as facilitators and centers of the family. They literally birth the family, which is the ultimate nucleus of civilization. And so ultimately then, the children really kind of become the purpose of civilization, really. And so our focus should be on producing a situation like you highlighted, Swithin, where, it can be seen as a kind of, it's easy to talk about it as a golden age in the 1950s where, or similar maybe for different countries, similar time period where a normal man in a normal craft could have had a house and paid off any mortgage or anything like that very soon after they're having moved in, and they could have 3 children that could be supported by that one wage, and the wife could was encouraged, to not just be there for the children, not just to excel in the home, but also to be productive within the home. That's something that's so very important, the understanding that the part of our constant relinquishing of responsibilities away to the state is our also becoming increasingly passive consumers rather than creating our own entertainment in the home, rather than just turning on Netflix or something like that, or just going to a screen, creating our own entertainment somehow, being musical, and largely women would have been facilitators of that productive culture within the home. Now, this may sound all very, very idealistic to a lot of people, but we can say there were times in the past where that was the expected norm. That would have been a standard. And we can say that now it is the exact opposite. We can say that now, what do we see? What are the ideals that are portrayed in our stories? When we do go to Netflix or whatever it is. What do we see? Do we see anything resembling that whatsoever? Or do we see something that's actually really very opposed to that? Really opposed to what, I would see as godliness. And what I mean by that is, goodness, beauty, truth, these traditional what can I say, roles, the traditional roles that would have been played and expected of a man, of a woman, which would have ultimately been much more psychologically healthy, which would have provided a real sense of place, and what Roger Scruton spoke of as being the sense of home, the proper sense of home in society, which is needed just as much as a sense of transcendence. It's just as much a human need, a universal human need, as a sense of transcendence, to have that rootedness there, a sense of place in the home. Yes, okay, I'll finish there. I just wanted to agree with you, Swithin, and develop upon my thoughts there a little bit.
I don't necessarily think I want paleocons to be better. That's partly why I criticize them. I'm sympathetic to the idea that paleocons and paleolibertarians have about the past. I just want them to be better. So think of it as constructive criticism. I'm not merely dissing the past in general, and I think I stated that quite clearly. I think there are positive features about the past, although I want a proper history done or proper accounting done, because I think we do need to take into account the benefits of technology. Swithin was yesterday giving me some links about Peter Hitchens' book on the brief history of crime. And one of Peter Hitchens' points, crime was probably lower in England in 1900 based on certain numbers, and actually if you factor in the fact that modern medicine saves a lot of people that it wouldn't save. But then again, modern medicine is a part of one of the benefits of industry. And this is actually one of the points that you get into the Nassim Taleb versus Steven Pinker debate on, whether modern warfare is worse than medieval warfare. One of the things, you can save a lot more people in modern warfare. Many diseases would be just deadly. Even in 1914, they'd be deadly. So one of the benefits is technology, but then again, industrialization is a double-edged sword, like most things. As far as the property rights, the housing being more expensive, I would agree. But this is where I'm a libertarian. I mean, here in the United States, one of the reasons real estate is so expensive is A, senior citizens use it as like a retirement nest egg, and B, property taxes. There's basically rents paid to the public school system. And I mean, whether you're Adam Smith / Marxist labor theory of value economist, even if you are that, to a certain extent, it just pays. You can easily, if you gave tax credits, for example, to homeschoolers, I think the number of homeschoolers would go enormously up. If you gave $10,000 to $15,000 of tax credits to families, I think if you had 5 children, I mean there's $70,000 you could have. So yeah, I do think the state positions people not to have children, and in particular the school districts. But then again, I'm opposed to public education in that regard. I think if you just got rid of the tax system, would that harm certain people? Yes. And my final thing is, in general, I guess my biggest problem with you, Rick, and less so with Swithin, we've had a number of discussions on this, is the you talk about godliness, but this is where the old reactionary and Puritan thesis has to be brought up. In Britain and the United States, Methodists and Catholics from 1900 to today, the churches today are generally social justice churches who are in advocates of minimum public schooling, and all these other things. Again, the suffragette movement that had Christian origins. It did have Marxist origins, but then again, if you want to go down the rabbit hole, Hegel and Kant. So there's our borderline Christians anyway. So as far as the godliness point, that's a whole nother episode in itself. But in general, I do think there's certain ways in which Christianity led to certain factors that the paleocons play about. In particular, Protestant Christianity. But again, Catholic countries and Catholics have had basically the same trajectory on various things. I think eventually the Catholic Church will allow women to be priests as well. I say that pessimistically, but I mean, so in that regard, if that's the last bastion of defense, there's that. So, I mean, we're getting probably here at the end of the hour. If you want to make any final statements, I'll start with Swithin, and then I'll give it to Rick, and he can finish it out.
What I would say is, on a more practical basis, which I mentioned before with respect to housing, I think one of the other reasons why people don't get married as early, or that they don't have children earlier, is partially due to the fact that a lot of people will want to buy a house, get married, and then have children. And the amount of money that they require to be able to purchase a house or and to be stable in that is so much higher than it used to be, especially for lower middle class, working class families. So it kind of gets pushed later. Now, of course, not everybody who follows that model will have children earlier, like in their teens, with various different people, etc. But it does push those who want to sort of wait and plan, as it were. And quite a lot of them do, although to be fair, most people I know, more than anything else. But I do think it is a case that a lot of people want to, before they have children, be settled in a place that they can call their own, which isn't the case with rent, because you've been kicked out at any time. And so, related to that, one of the reasons why, well, obviously the central banking system increasing asset prices, etc., keeps the prices high, but also the fact the education system means that you're not learning productive skills until you leave school or university, because you learn useful and productive skills in the workplace primarily. And even if you're taught sort of abstract skills, that's perfectly fine. But business and the marketplace wants you to have done something that you can sell, and you can't sell that directly to customers. So I think I say relatively easy, we just need to abolish central banking and the child labour laws. And then, and of course public schooling. So it's easy, obviously. But if you had a society in which we could get house prices lower and be able to get people to be productive earlier, it would mean that sort of like even like a 21-year-old man would be a productive member of society and have relatively wage earning capacity, such that it would be easier to have family formation earlier, and I think that would generally be healthier in general. Rik?
Yeah, so I suppose to summarize my what I've tried to express here, the general trend that we see with certain declines in the family, certainly in its traditional Christian conception, I see these as being part and parcel of the general individualizing trend of the modern secular liberal state. And it's for that reason we see, for example, as Swithin's pointed out much better than myself, women are encouraged out into the workforce. Indeed, all of us have been atomized, as Swithin put it, as simply economic units within the greater machine, the greater state apparatus. We're seen as points on GDP scales and that sort of thing. And so, what can stop this? What can possibly reverse that process? Well, I've agreed with Swithin that the family is very important, and certainly there are plenty of libertarians who would agree with me. Not least of all Jeff Deist. He pointed out that the family is really the final bastion against the state, because it's not born out of the modern conceptions of the individual, where we're all red in tooth and claw, battling against each other as Hobbes, conceived of us. The family is really a testament to pre-modern concepts of the individual, much more Christian concepts of the individual, where the fundamental basis is of, gifting, it's of charity, it's of love. And we see that in the primordial relationship between the mother and the child. For us to be here having this conversation, necessarily, we must have been shown some unconditional love, during our formative years, to greater or lesser extent. But nevertheless, there it is. And so, just as we can conceive as the family as being, the final bastion against the state, I think we can also see that Christian morality has been a civilization-wide cultural framework which extends those organic relationships which seem to defy the state. They provide communities, and historically they've even provided businesses and that sort of thing, which were outside of state power. They exercised, their own authority aside from the state. This is why, throughout Christendom you had an advanced civilization, but one which was actually stateless. I see that as something which is to be celebrated and, hopefully emulated again. So in terms of, Tim raised the point that, we don't see that kind of Christianity today. We see certainly a lot of bishops and that sort of thing. They're celebrated in the media. We hear more from them when they are celebrating socialism and various kinds of things, sexual perversion even. And so my response to that would be, is that actually Christianity, or is that a divergence from Christianity? Is that actually traditional Christianity? Is that actually canon law? Is that ordinary teaching of the church? Or is this certain bishops who are not being declared heretics, but they are nevertheless promoting these ideas? And certainly, in the development of socialism, these other movements that Tim suggested, within the historic context of the West, these had to emerge from a Christian context, and these had to attach to themselves, certain labels which would have been acceptable to the general population, which would have had, Christian inclinations, that sort of thing. And so I would say, if we want to see the morality of the church, particularly regarding the family, and shrinking the power which the state exercises over individual freedom, which is historically what the church did, then we have to be a part of the church, and we've got to be there, voicing our opinions and struggling against those voices which would seek to pervert those things. And so I'll leave it there, I think.
My final comment here, and I'll let Swithin finish it out for real, is the problem you discussed with the church, to me, is the same problem I have with the Marxists, in the sense that they'll say, the Soviet Union wasn't true Marxism, which is a perfectly reasonable defense you can make. But if you go into deeper theological realms, you get into sort of the problem of, the problem of evil, the problem of original sin, and so forth. And you just view these all as subcategories of one problem. People can't get along with each other, including your parents, including someone's parents. Again, I came from a quite stable background. I have nothing to complain about, and I'm very glad. To some extent, I want the system to be extended. I just don't know to the extent that it can be extended, and I'm at times skeptical to the degree in which the past had as good. I'm not a progressivist. I don't think the past was all terrible. I think there's plenty of good things about the past. I think it's quite clear that 1900s, considering the environmental adversities, the claiming of huge amounts of getting out of the Malthusian trap. It's only Christian societies that industrialized first. Other societies copied it, and of course Marxism grew out of Christianity. I do think Christianity is quite a great mimetic. I think the Rene Girard term. It's a great mimetic recipe. But it seems like this recipe has a lot of similar recipes that end up creating quite bizarre things, which end up as dead ends. And whether or not Hegel was a Christian or Kant was a Christian is to a certain extent a erroneous topic. But I enjoyed talking to you, both of you. And Swithin, if you want to finish this out.
I'd just like to thank Rik for joining us again. We've enjoyed having you. And if you have enjoyed listening to this, I would like you to share with your friends and family and people who you may think would find this of interest, and subscribe to us on YouTube and on Podbean. The more subscribers we get, the higher we get in the searches, and the more people can enjoy it. And if you would like to contact us with ideas for the show, please contact us at mindcrimelibертyshow@gmail.com. That's mindcrimelibертyshow@gmail.com.